Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is M Scanlon, who is the Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy, and Civil Polity at Harvard University. He is the 2008 Howison Lecturer at Berkeley. His publications include What We Owe to Each Other, The Difficulty of Tolerance, Essays in Political Philosophy. Professor Scanlon, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Indianapolis and spent the first, I guess, almost 20 years of my life there before I went east to go to college and sort of never returned.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world? Well,
my father was a lawyer and he loved the law and the Constitution. So legal questions of legal policy were an important part of the dinner table conversations I was growing up. And he and my mother had also both been quite interested in philosophy as undergraduates, although that wasn't their major, but it was certainly, it had a big impact on them. So the idea that there was this subject called philosophy was something I knew about, even though I never read a philosophy book, or it never appeared to me as something we talked about much. But so when I went to college, I saw these courses, philosophy, so I thought, well, Mom and Dad used to talk about that. It sounded interesting to me. I'll give it a try.
Mm-hmm. And when before you went to college, give us an example of a kind of a discussion you would have around the table about some constitutional issue.
Well, we talked, my father sometimes defended, he was a litigator, and he sometimes defended libel suits, and so he was very devoted to the First Amendment. So we often talked about the First Amendment. And one particular moment I remember that had a huge impact on me, I was going for a walk with my father sometime in the early 50s, and we were arguing about an article that had appeared in the Indianapolis Star, which was a client of my father's. He always had to defend them, although he wouldn't have defended their politics, which were very different from ours, very conservative. And they had a particularly misleading series of articles on some subject I don't remember, and I was incensed by this. My 11-year-old anger was up, and I said to my father, how can they be allowed to publish this kind of thing? It's misleading people about these important questions. And my father said, but who's to decide what they can publish and what they can't? And I felt as if I'd been turned to stone on the moment. I was so ashamed of myself that this was a really interesting, difficult question. I couldn't answer it. I had no idea. I felt caught, but between the sense that it's a very bad thing that this sort of thing is out there, but this reply seemed absolutely right, and so the tension between these ideas, the obvious rationality apparently of restricting expression versus on the other hand, the idea that it really wasn't proper, really stuck with me, and it's something I continue to think about. And I suppose, I don't know how many years later, 20 years later or something, when I was first writing on political philosophy, that was the first thing I wrote about.
Mm-hmm. And as a young person, before you went to college, were you engaged in debates and arguments? Did you bring a philosophical bent to your way of thinking early, even before college?
I suppose I was drawn toward abstract thinking, but I was mainly interested in math and science. I suppose mathematics was my main interest. And so I think I had a sort of a bent for abstract thinking, but I didn't really think about philosophy in the usual sense. I wasn't occupied with paradoxes or the sort of thing that one might have been thinking about.
And as a young person, any mentors other than your parents who shaped your thinking, high school teachers or something?
Well, no. The high school teachers that had the biggest impact on me, again, were my math teachers, who inspired me to work hard. And they got me sort of interested in logic, because we did proofs and things like that, and I found that proofs in geometry, for example. I wasn't so interested in geometry, that is, the structure of space, but I was very interested in the idea that you could prove things and in the puzzle of discovering proofs. So it was natural that when I went into philosophy, one of the main things I got interested in was logic, and that was my main subject of inquiry for the first 10 years or so that I was in the subject. But they didn't really turn me on to philosophy in a direct sense, no.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to do your undergraduate work?
I was an undergraduate at Princeton, and then I went to England for a year, to Oxford, really just taking a year out to try to decide whether I could take the plunge and become an academic, which seemed to me a very strange choice of life at the time, rather than go back to Indiana and practice law, which is what I'd always been assuming that I would do. And then I decided philosophy was something I couldn't give up. So I went back to the U.S. and went to Harvard to be a graduate student, and then after just a few years went back to Princeton to teach. So I followed a very small circle.
And what was it about philosophy that drew you in? Was it the space in logic and argumentation that you had brought to the table?
Well, initially, it's a good question. I don't fully know the answer. Certainly, initially, questions about logic and the structure of argument were the things that most appealed to me, the technical side of the subject. In fact, I wasn't interested in moral philosophy at all. I suppose I was a kind of logical positivist, as that was a popular but already much criticized doctrine when I was a student. But I was rather skeptical of whether there was anything interesting to be said about moral and political questions from a philosophical point of view. So I only took a moral philosophy course because I was told I had to. It was a requirement of graduation. When I took it, I thought it was terrific, and I really got engaged with the questions. Although in the beginning, I was mainly interested in them sort of from a technical point of view. I thought that formal decision theory and welfare economics were a way of answering questions of social philosophy and individual morality, and that's what my first teacher in the subject had been into, and he really turned me on to that side of the subject. But after a year or two of working in that way, I became sort of frustrated with I loved the formal techniques, but I found the results a little bit arid, and I thought there was more to it, so I then broadened out and got interested in other things.
I think our audience would be curious to know what exactly a philosopher does, and a way I like to get at this problem is to ask you, for the benefit of students who might watch this, what is it? What are the skills, the temperament required to do philosophy, as you're helping us understand what it is a philosopher does?
Well, the skills, I think, are a taste for analysis. And skill at drawing distinctions, the patience to keep doing it, and the tolerance for a fair amount of frustration because it is inherently difficult. It's no accident, I think, that philosophical questions are difficult in this way. Philosophical questions, to my mind, are questions that are raised by some way of understanding life and the world that we're naturally drawn to use, but which can't be answered satisfactorily using that method. So, for example, if religion is an important way of understanding life and the world, then the question whether God exists is an important philosophical question. It's a philosophical question because religion raises it. Everything depends on whether there is a God, but answers within a religion presuppose that there's a God. So you aren't going to discover whether there's a God or not by reading Scripture. So similarly, if science is the important way of understanding life in the world, then it's a philosophical question. What's the difference between a chance regularity and a genuine law of nature? And how can you tell that you're seeing one rather than the other by simply looking at a finite number of experiments? Everything about empirical science assumes that that's true, that science doesn't just discover coincidental regularities, it discovers kind of how nature really works. And it does that by inferring from a certain number of carefully constructed experiments. So those questions are questions that science presupposes and depends on, but they can't be answered in the laboratory. So they're philosophical questions. So philosophical questions are questions that are, in this sense, external to some normal way of thinking. Because they're external, there isn't an obvious way of how to answer them. So the philosopher is a bit at sea, or out there in the void, so to speak, trying to synthesize, trying to make up or find some grip on these questions. And there are also philosophical questions that don't come from some established system of thought like religion or science that are just perennials, like do we have free will? How can we, how do we understand our idea of moral obligations to each other? We come to, we're taught, we learn, we develop some sense of what our obligations to other people are, and we can reason using those commonly understood standards about what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. But there's a question, why should we care about that? Why should we be willing to sacrifice in order not to do something that's wrong? That's not going to be a question that's answered within the ordinary moral principles, because those principles presuppose that there's something important there, but it isn't obvious what it is. So philosophy then takes up the task of trying to give an explanation of why these are something we should care about. And that's a task of philosophy that's as old as, old as the Greeks. That's what Socrates and Plato were doing, and all of their successors. So philosophy is difficult because it is external in this way, and for that reason it requires patience, because students tend to get frustrated because there aren't going to be isn't an obvious answer. They say, well, what's the answer? So, well, here's a plausible answer. Here's the reasons why it seems like a good answer. But of course, there are difficulties, and you're not a good philosopher unless you're also always looking around to find the difficulties with what you've said. But not everybody has a tolerance for that kind of tension.
So if I can try to cut into some of what you're saying here, what is it you as a philosopher makes personal choices about the problems that you're going to address? And what do you have any thoughts about what has led you to particular topics? For example, problems of political philosophy?
Well, as I said earlier, I got interested in problems of freedom of speech because they were a topic of conversation. They just seemed inherently puzzling and important. But I also was interested in questions, say, about the foundation of mathematics, which I didn't come up because. So it's hard to say exactly what makes one. There are many things out there that are puzzling, and it's hard to say what draws you to one particular puzzle rather than another. I suppose it has to be a puzzle about something that you really care about, and it also has to be something that you feel able to say something about. There are questions about, let's say, the metaphysics of time or other kinds of which are puzzles, but I don't feel I got a real grip on them. So I tend not to be drawn to those.
But is it an area that you decide on? Do you wind up researching the area in order? Because what you're trying to do is formulate the right questions for a particular subfield or endeavor. Well,
people divide about this, and one can be embarrassed by the answer one finds oneself giving. Of course, when you think about a field, there are a lot of question in philosophy. There are a lot of smart people that thought about it, and it certainly makes sense to go see what they had to say. Some people think, look, that's the main thing you want to do, develop an understanding of how this developed, what Kant had to say about it, what criticisms there were, how it led, and so on. And that's certainly a very important form of inquiry. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that's not, although I've learned an awful lot by studying Kant and other Mill, other Hume, other people in the history of philosophy, I tend to want to just go away and think about it myself. I do. I'm a little drawn just toward, okay, let's get the bearings and think about these answers as possible answers, but then, when it comes down to it, you got to decide yourself. So you have to at some point switch off the reading and just start thinking and scribbling.
And where does, what does creativity in philosophy look like?
Well, it isn't, I think, on the whole, just, I'd say flashes of insight. It comes out of noticing things that other people haven't noticed because you've been putting your mind's eye on them more carefully and being willing to consider objections to what one would normally say more seriously and more penetratingly. So I think that the real original bursts of creativity and philosophy come to others who haven't made the discovery in a certain sense as a revelation, but also saying, yes, of course I actually was somehow aware of that already. That is, a good philosopher finds things in the materials that are really available to everybody, which once the person says them, you think, oh yeah, right, there was that problem there, and I was kind of turning my eye away from it. So I think insight in philosophy comes from careful attention to the questions as they present themselves to us.
And in reading your essays in The Difficulty of Tolerance, which I will show our audience, it seems that in this process, clarity, both in the sense of the way you're thinking about the problem, but also the expressing of that clarity so the reader will come to the same insight that you are leading to. Both of those are very important.
That's certainly the most important thing. And when one goes back and rereads one's essays, the thing is one's most dissatisfied with is that one hasn't been as clear as one thought one was be. And so the constant drive to try to make it clearer is one of the most important things. That's right.
And this book is a collection of essays essentially on political philosophy.
Right.
As a subfield of philosophy and of your work, what is distinctive about that focus of your attention?
What's distinctive about political philosophy as opposed to other kinds of philosophy? What's distinctive about it, as I see it, is that it has to do with our relations with each other that are mediated through the institutions we share. Moral philosophy has to do, by my lights, primarily with what we owe to each other as individuals, and a lot of those are just questions of, am I going to tell you the truth? Am I going to kick you? Am I going to keep my appointment? Mm-hmm. Or questions like that, which don't necessarily depend upon larger scale institutions, although they may have different effects because they take place within such institutions. But some of what we owe to each other, we owe to each other as participants in large-scale institutions. We pay our taxes, we vote, we take part in political processes, and we feel obliged to obey and accept the results of those processes and to not interfere with other people's participation in them. So the question, well, we're born into these institutions. We just find them operating around us. Why should we accept them? What demands can we make on them? If people think they're being treated improperly by them, when is it appropriate for them to complain? When are their complaints justified? So those they're moral questions in a sense, in a large sense, because they're questions of what we owe to each other, but they're not just, so to speak, questions of personal interaction. They're questions about the conditions of our participation in large-scale systems of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were dealing with these issues of political philosophy, the rigor, the logic is still required, but you're dealing with an area of passion, of where people have very strong views that aren't always driven by logic. In fact, how do you reconcile those tensions, or does your background in philosophy make it easier for you to do?
Well, I don't know if it makes it easier. It imposes a kind of discipline on me about focusing my attention, but I guess I would register just a little bit of skepticism about this contrast between logic on the one hand and the emotions on the other. Logic, of course, it's a formal subject, operates according to definite rules, and you can turn it into a mathematics like calculus. But let's not think about logic, but as a reasoning more broadly, when I'm drawing inferences about whether I'm really seeing a chair or a person or a blackboard, or when I'm reasoning about what's likely to happen, is it going to rain or something like that. That's reasoning in a looser sense. So I'm responding, I take certain evidence as grounds for drawing a certain kind of conclusion. But I can take evidence as grounds for drawing a conclusion. I can take, facts such as, the fact that I told you I was going to be here, whatever, as a reason to do something. I think both of those things are reasoning in exactly the same sense, even though the second one motivates me to act, maybe, in a way that the first doesn't, in a more direct and obvious way. So I think, and even when we are, as people might say, acting out of emotion, I think when people act out of emotion, they're acting for a reason. If I'm angry at you, that means I'm inclined to take the fact that you wouldn't like it if I said something as a reason to say it. So I think we can't understand emotions without looking at them as, you might say, complexes of tendencies to see things as reasons. So I think the idea that when I'm reasoning about whether it's going to rain or about whether I should go to Berkeley or not, that's one thing. But acting on emotions is something else. I think the idea of responding to what we see as reasons, either consciously or unreflectively, is common across these domains, and there's not a big separation as it is often suggested by the use of the terms.
In this collection, you direct your attention to a number of really important problems in political philosophy: human rights, freedom of expression, tolerance, urgency, and so forth. And I'm just curious, in this realm, is it more important to go back and look at what the great philosophers have said as you carve out your position? Is this an area where you find yourself doing that more of the time than in other areas of philosophy?
Well, as I said earlier, one can be embarrassed by the answers one finds in this, but I think the answer is no. I think for some reason, I don't know quite why, my writings in moral philosophy have paid more attention to the great writers of the past, particularly Hume, Kant, and to some degree Aristotle, I think as the main exemplars, than what I do in political philosophy, which tends more to just look at the questions or to deal with the way they've been presented by more recent figures such as my teacher John Rawls, and look less back. I don't know why that's true, but it just does seem to me to be a matter of fact.
Now, what led me to look at these particular essays was which I gather were written from the 70s to the early 1990s. They deal with a number of issues that in the post 9/11 world have come back in a very powerful way, and so on. And so before we get into some of your ideas on some of these issues, I'm curious as to how you think your ideas, once they've been put down, are affected by the changing times, basically. For me, it struck me that everything you had written long ago still applied today. And I'm just sort of curious as to what extent there is any impact in the relevancy of the times on what you do, and which want to impel you to go back and read this stuff and see if it still stands up.
Well, when the first article that I published, which is the first article in that book, is called A Theory of Freedom of Expression, which I wrote in the early 1970s. It begins with a quote from Justice Holmes. It said, when you see that speech is going to cause certain harms, there's nothing more rational than trying to restrict speech in order to prevent those harms. But, he then says, when we understand how history works, that we see that we have to hold back this. So he was talking about cases that arose around the time of the First World War and anarchist agitation and so on. But so as cycles of political controversy come around with periodicity, they raise essentially the same questions about is Congress entitled to act to prevent perceived serious harms at the expense of limiting citizens' rights to participate in the political forum, to express their ideas or whatever. That's a perennial question, and it's not surprising that it keeps coming back. So I was thinking about it in the context of the Vietnam War, reading someone who had written about it at the time of the First World War, and now we've got another war on, so national security issues are again on the forefront. So the similar questions come back. But they don't always come back in the same way. Another way in which questions of freedom of expression frequently arise has to do with sex and social mores. So restricting of pornography or literature that's thought to be obscene or offensive is another perennial topic. But at the time I wrote that essay, and even the subsequent follow-up to it in the later 1970s, the main forms in which that demand that expression on sexual matters should be limited was mainly coming from people who wanted to prevent sex from being discussed. There was a sense of sexual repression was the way the pro-speech side would have described the worry. But by the time you get to the later 1970s and beyond, it's coming from feminists who are worried about it as a question of equality. So if we want to preserve a social outlook in which women are respected, we need to restrict expression that perpetuates stereotypes or suggests that women want to be dominated or are properly dominated. And similar questions come up about hate speech with respect to racial equality. So the idea that we need to restrict speech in order to preserve a certain social outlook is a perennial. But exactly what the issue is, whether we want to prevent people from being too concerned with sex or whether we want to preserve equality, those things may change, and so one has to think about them in a different way.
And so the role of the philosopher and his contribution really is to define these problems in such a way that these waves of different groups who come forward do not undermine our basic understanding of the principles that are at stake.
Well, we have to refine our understanding of the principles that are at stake in order for us to see how we can, on the one hand, do justice to the claims that people are making, but still somehow explain how we can preserve a climate of open discussion, which we think is important. How should we understand the values that are in conflict? And I mean, here's the thing that's always on the agenda. What kind of judgment are we making when we're saying, although this value is important, restricting expression for that reason would violate a right, and therefore that draws a line. What kind of a judgment are we making when we appeal to a right? That's the underlying question that keeps coming back.
So help us understand now for our audience what you came to see as the important dimensions of freedom of expression. And we're in this realm of political philosophy where we're talking about our relations, people's relations with their institutions.
Right. Well, when I first thought about it, I thought, in this first article I wrote, I was very taken with the idea of individual autonomy. Citizens, it's important for citizens not only to be able to make up their own mind about important questions about life and politics, but also to have their relations with each other and with government defined by the idea that they are autonomous. So I thought that recognizing other people's autonomy, recognizing citizens' autonomy, drew a sharp line that it's incompatible with seeing citizens as autonomous for government to decide this can't be published because it might lead them to draw some false conclusion, right? Whether the conclusion's false is up to them to decide. That's what it means to treat them as autonomous. Later on, I came to think that restriction on what can be on the way speech can be restricted was too tight, and one should adopt a more, might say, I don't know if I want to say practical, but a more instrumental view that the main reason why the government can't have unlimited power to restrict speech has to do with the dangerousness of giving governments that power. And so we're properly more willing to allow governments, say, to restrict some kinds of false advertising than we are to allow them to restrict what they take to be false political speech, because government is, one might assume, although this isn't always true, somewhat less partisan and less untrustworthy and less likely to abuse its power in the realm of false advertising about products, about how dangerous your lawnmower is or something, or how long your car is going to last, than it is in the realm of deciding what are true answers to the basic political questions of our time. So I thought that my original idea that it's autonomy that sets the limits was too rigid, and one needed to take into account the question of how dangerous is this? How dangerous is it for government to have a power of a certain sort? So there's a lot of drawing on historical experience from past governments and to see what would happen if government had the power to do this. And when we think there's a right, what we think is it's too dangerous for government to have that power, so they don't have it. That is to say, we have a right that they not do it.
And going back to this idea of autonomy, you make this important distinction about the information that people need so that they can really be an independent agent, right, versus, helping somebody with the means to take action which the thought might lead them to.
Right. I did, yes, a friend of mine said, when I was writing about this, he said, well, I hope you'll explain why people can't publish their recipe for making nerve gas at home. Mm-hmm. And so I incorporated that into my article. So I think people are entitled to the information. They shouldn't be blocked from having the information they need to make political decisions. But I don't need to know how to make nerve gas in my sink in order to decide who to vote for. So I thought in that original article, and to some degree I still think that information about technical matters isn't necessarily something that can't be restricted, whereas information that just might lead me to decide that single-payer health care was a good thing or was a bad thing isn't something government can restrict because they think I might do the wrong thing with it.
Now, in the wake of 9/11, we developed a new scenario of the possible threats to the United States, which one could argue provide an opening for the state to make a new case with regard to what its domain should be with regard to freedom of speech. One
Right.
thinks of the notion of a surprise attack, the notion that you're dealing now with terrorist groups that might have access to nuclear weapons and so on. In light of these changes, what impact or what intuitions do you have about how you might change your thinking on matters of free expression, if at all?
Well, as I said earlier, these seem like new questions, but in a sense they're old questions. Although I think what changes is not so much 9/11, but new technology changes things to some extent. Now, one of the most important things we want to protect in protecting freedom of expression is the people's opportunities for advocacy and people's opportunities to find out whether other people agree with them about the propriety of particular political actions. It doesn't seem to me that the state is threatened, that Al Qaeda presents a worry in that dimension, although, Muslim imams may make inflammatory statements, but it seems to me that's something you got to live with. I think that's an old question. I think it's a settled question, and I don't think 9/11 changes it. Although it gets us more excited about it. Just the way at the time of the First World War, people were excited about anarchists making speeches, and I think there's a general tendency of the government to exaggerate the degree to which they need to protect us by restricting people's simple statements of advocacy. There's another question, on the other hand, which is the communications between conspirators. So maybe they do need to be able to restrict the way people can communicate with each other if they're actually in the process of carrying out a plan. I think that's not an issue of freedom of speech. It may become an issue of privacy. The question, and there it does seem to me, again, that's a separate area, but it's sort of settled. You need to have some kind of prior cause. You can't just start listening to everybody's communications with everybody because you're going to fish around and see if you can find somebody who's in the process of developing a conspiracy. But where there's probable cause to think these people might be engaged in a conspiracy, it seems to me it's not an issue of freedom of speech that they might be able to do it, nor I think is it an issue of privacy. But the main question where freedom of speech comes in is this area of public advocacy, and I think that the risks of that public advocacy might turn more people on to being against the government is a risk that we simply have to accept.
Now, how bound are these discussions by the kind of polity that you're talking about, basically? And how do you think about those matters? Because, your essay on human rights is making an effort to sort of think about, well, what are the circumstances under which one should intervene, and what we're talking about, is it universal or is it not?
Right. Well, yes, right. Your question raises two difficult issues. One is relativism, and the other is the permissibility of intervention. And I think it's important to keep these two things separate. The first is, I believe in an open society. I think that defensible institutions have to be ones that the citizens to whom they apply and who are asked to accept and obey them can object to, can raise questions, can protest against. That seems to me a basic requirement of legitimacy of institutions, and I'm inclined to say that's universal, right? That isn't just a parochial view about institutions. It's a view about what people can demand of institutions as a condition for being willing to accept them and go along with them. They have to be able to protest. So I'm not a relativist about that. Now, the exact form that protest needs to take, or the exact form that political institutions take, there's a certain range for variation there. But I think that there's a fairly strong universal truth. Now, we hear there's some other society where people aren't allowed to protest. That properly changes our view of the authority that government has to speak for those people. But it doesn't immediately follow that we can go out there and tell them they got to do something different. Well, we can tell them. I think we can say, we don't think that. Your citizens seem to us have a good case. But can we cut off their oil? Can we stop trading with them? Can we send in the Marines? Those are all much more difficult questions. So I think one wants to separate the question of do these standards apply from the question of what role do outsiders have in intervening to try to change people in one direction rather than another. But in addressing that question also, it's important to remember that they don't all have the same view about these things. Relativism is often put in a we versus they. Of course, we think that human life is special or sacred. We think that people have these rights. But of course, in this other society, they don't think. But they are almost never unanimous about this. The portion of they who've been put in jail for their political beliefs don't normally think that it's okay to put people in jail for their political beliefs. So in deciding what's right and wrong about what's happening in their country, you got to take into account the claims of the people who are in jail as well as the people who are outside it. But that said, there's still a further question about what are we able or entitled to do about it. Sometimes we are able to do something, maybe by expressing disapproval, maybe by withdrawing trade, but those are difficult questions, although those questions also are asked within a universal moral framework about what's permissible to do to somebody else. When are you permitted or even required to intervene to protect somebody against horrible treatment, and when are you required as an outsider to stay out? That's a general moral question that applies across boundaries.
Mm-hmm. As I listened to you and as I looked at your essays, I'm struck by how relevant this all is. And what's in the back of my mind is the question, how does philosophy make an impact? In other words, obviously you make an impact on the field of philosophy, on the students you have, but I must honestly say, as I was reading this, I said, hey, more people should be reading this because it has a cleansing quality on the mind as you think about the issues that you're actually reading in the New York Times.
Well, I'm extremely pleased you'd say that, Eric. And of course, it's a matter of frustration. In the early 1970s, some friends of mine and I got together and founded a journal called Philosophy and Public Affairs, and it's amusing or maybe embarrassing to go back and read the preamble that we wrote, in which we said something like what you just said, that we think that philosophy has something to contribute to moral issues that are centrally concerned with the issues of our time, and by founding this journal, we want to, on the one hand, encourage philosophers to address themselves more to this issue, these practical issues, than they have before, and second, to bring their thoughts to a wider audience. Looking back, I think we even said philosophy has something to contribute to the understanding and even the resolution of these issues. That seems wildly optimistic, looking back. But looking back now, whatever it's been now, 35 years, I have to say that I think we were really quite successful on the first front. That is, philosophers did, not simply as a result of what we did, but partly because of the spirit of the time, come to turn their minds much more in succeeding decades to practical questions. I don't think we succeeded very well in getting people outside the philosophical community to attend to that. I think that the subscriptions of that journal never got beyond 3,000, I believe, and it was cited in a few law review articles, but not much beyond there. So it's hard to crack that frontier. I've written a few things in the New York Review of Books, maybe in a few other journals like that, but I don't know that they've gotten a very wide audience. I once participated with a similar group, the same group of folks, in writing an amicus curiae brief for the Supreme Court. This was in the case about assisted suicide. I'd done a similar thing earlier with another group of people in a case having to do with academic freedom and freedom of speech. And that one was, the one about freedom of speech was seen to be never noticed by anybody. But the one on assisted suicide got a fair amount of play. It's sometimes referred to, often negatively. And a couple of magazines actually mentioned in their stories. The reporters called me up about it. But I was struck by the fact that when the reporters called me up, they never wanted to ask me, why do you guys think this? Or why do you guys think that? Rather, the only question they wanted to know was, who do you guys think you are that you should be pronouncing on this subject? Which I thought was a little bit surprising.
So it's really their attitude toward you as opposed to the substance of your position.
Yes, these pointy-headed academics getting out there trying to tell us what to do. I think that seemed to be the attitude.
One of the essays in this collection that also struck me was this one, as we just talked about, the one on human rights. And what is there anything that one would like to add now in the face of, if you look at the 90s and the emphasis of human rights and how the political process in essence corrupted some of the basic insights we had about human rights and turned it into a notion of really changing societies that couldn't be changed.
That's right.
And you address that in your essay.
Well, I do, although only in one paragraph or one sentence. I wish I said, look, even if you think it's permissible for people to intervene, that people who are torturing people and throwing them in jail don't have a right not to be interfered with, still, we've got to look at the question of how effectively could we intervene? And that may be a very important barrier. I think I said that in more or less those words, although that was buried in one particular paragraph. If I were writing again, I might puff that up. But I would, if I were writing that essay over again, and sometimes I wish I could, I certainly would say something different for a couple of reasons. That essay was really a kind of product of the late Cold War. It came to be in an interesting way, having to do with your previous question about how philosophy can become influential. A friend who was running an Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at the University of Maryland organized a series of working groups bringing together people from the academy, mostly philosophers and political scientists and some economists, with decision makers of various sorts from Washington, congressional staff people, in this instance on human rights, some congressional staff people, actually a couple of people from Congress. I think Harkin was there because he'd written this amendment, the Harkin Amendment, which restricted the sale of weapons to countries that engaged in systematic violations of human rights. And also even there was a procurement officer from the Pentagon who participated in this. So we met 4 times over the course of several months arguing about it, and then we wrote papers for a volume, and that was it. That was what it was from. So when I was talking there about human rights as a neutral concern, that's the title of that essay. This was the early 1980s, I guess. I was still thinking about the East-West, the Soviet bloc and a NATO dichotomy. That is, that human rights were being accused of being an expression of bourgeois values as against the proper economic rights that were supposedly being recognized in the socialist countries. And so I was trying to argue about how human rights really are concerns that span that disagreement about, if there may be disagreement about economic policy, but there shouldn't be disagreement about whether it's all right to put people in jail without any kind of due process and things like this. So that was my idea of the neutrality of human rights. But if you fast forward now to our own time, the Cold War is over. Human rights are now being charged with a kind of lack of neutrality, but that's not the dimension along which neutrality is being disputed. It's rather cultural differences between Asian values and Western values, or between societies organized along religious lines and societies that are not. So the relevant dimension around which the neutrality of human rights might be challenged is quite different now than it was then. And also we've had more experience with intervention, as you say, so I would have highlighted, although I firmly believed that paragraph, I thought it was important, I'd highlight it more if I were reading it now. So those are 2 examples of the way in which change of events can certainly change what one would say and what one would emphasize if one were trying to write about a question philosophically.
Do you feel impelled at all to try to rewrite the essay, or is it something that... Well,
I thought when I was putting together this collection, I thought, should I try to rewrite this or write an afterword? And of all the essays in that book, I was most tempted to do that with respect to that one. But several people I knew who had written follow-on essays that referred to that had basically made the points that the central points that I would have made. And so I would have had to go back and discuss what they had said. And again, I think it would have fitted a little oddly in the volume. So I decided to leave it as it was and live with it and think that maybe later I'll write another essay, which I do hope to do. I just gave a seminar with a political scientist and Amartya Sen, the economist at Harvard, on rights and human rights. So I'm thinking about it again, and I might write something else.
One of the other essays in here, interestingly enough, and again, I must say the topics you touch on in this book have come to the fore again, even though they always exist through time. It's just they before us more powerfully. You talk about tolerance, and tolerance is a recognition of common membership that is deeper than these conflicts, a recognition that others are just as qualified as we are to their contribution to the definition of society. Are you pessimistic about the way we act on tolerance, based on the insights that you give us here?
Well, I'm pessimistic, maybe, but perhaps at a different level. What I said in that essay was that the main issue of tolerance is that we all care about what kind of society we live in. tolerance arises out of the fact that that society belongs to all of us. None of us has ownership of it, and recognizing that it's other people's society just as much as ours involves recognizing their entitlement to participate in the evolution of its mores, to dress the way they want to dress, to engage in the kind of sexual life that they want to engage in, to be religious or not religious as they choose. All those things are, private decisions in a certain sense, but they have a public dimension. And if a lot of people make one choice or another along with those dimensions, it changes what the society is like for all of us. So I wanted to say that tolerance is a difficult doctrine to accept because it involves putting ourselves in the hands of our fellow citizens and recognizing we got to live with these people, and so we're going to have to let the society go the way the most of them decide it's going to go. So I can be pessimistic about that. I can say I'm firmly committed to tolerance, but I may, I don't like the way the society becomes more and more saturated with sex, and more people more and more talking about it or concerned about it. I don't like that change of events, but I can't go out there and tell them what they can put on the billboards or what they can write in the magazines. I have to accept that I don't own the society, and now society is becoming more religious. I'm not religious, so living in a society in which I'm an outsider in a certain way is not comfortable, and maybe it'll evolve. Maybe it will evolve to that point. But living in an open society involves taking that risk. That's the price of really being connected with your fellow citizens at the deeper level, in which you recognize them as fellow citizens who own this thing just as much as we do. So I'm always worried about the consequences of tolerance, but I'm firmly committed to accepting the consequences. You were asking more about, am I worried that people are going to become less tolerant and try to impose on me? Well, yes, that's always a threat. That certainly is a threat, but I think we've done pretty well. The demand that people be prevented from living the lifestyle they want, expressing the values they want, because it's going to have a bad effect on social mores, is, as I've said, something that's always being raised. But so far, I think we've done reasonably well at beating it back. And so one always wants to be worried. That's what the ACLU and organizations like that are for, and they're necessary, because one always has to be worried about that. But that's a different kind of pessimism. I'm not so pessimistic. I'm hopeful on that, although I just have to keep my fingers crossed on the other front about where it's going to lead.
So I guess, is it fair to say that philosophy's stake in this is clarifying what the issues are with regard to something like tolerance, helping us understand, defining the questions so we see what the problem is in the bigger picture?
See what the problem is and see why a certain answer is one that we should rest with.
Yeah.
So as you said properly, philosophers anybody has a responsibility to try to participate in public discussion, and maybe philosophers have thought a lot about it. Maybe you think it would be a good thing. Many people may not think that. They ought to try to get their ideas out there. Having said that, it's maybe an embarrassing thing to say that philosophy is, to a very high degree, a first-person subject. I write about tolerance because, although I want to be tolerant, I think, but look, it's got this price. If we're all going to be tolerant, then what kind of society are we going to be living in? So I feel that tension, and I want to get an answer to the question, given that I think it has this cost, why am I so concerned with it? And that goes back to my interchange with my father, when I said, how can they let the newspaper say this kind of thing? People are being systematically misled about this subject, and that's going to have very bad political consequences. And my father said, who's to decide, right? So similar, I might say, about tolerance. Who's going to be the police? Are we going to say that somebody can just say, okay, now we've got the society we want, you can stop thinking about how you want to live, you got to accept this? No, we don't want anybody to decide that way. Well, why not? Can we say more about that side of it to make us see more clearly why that's the right side to come down, and then think about all the objections you can raise, and how can those objections be answered? So we're really trying to answer a curiosity that comes from within.
If students were to watch this program and they find your discussion of your own career interesting, how would you advise them to prepare for the future, either as a philosopher or as somebody who draws philosophy into their way of thinking, whatever that might be, in a profession?
Well, studying philosophy, for the topics we've just been talking about in political philosophy, studying political and constitutional history is a very good way to get a sense of the form that these questions have taken. And I think that they come more alive for people often when they read them not directly in the context of a philosophical theory, but by seeing how they played out in actual practice. So if you read one of Anthony Lewis's books about the First Amendment or about prisoners' right, or the rights of the accused, Gideon's Trumpet, that gives you a feeling of what the way in which rights play out in actual historical context. I think that gets you going. But then the next step is to try to think about it in a more theoretical way. And at that point, it's probably better to read. What you need to do is read some philosophy, or better, get into a class where you can argue with people who want to argue about it philosophically, so you can get some experience in doing it.
And you seem to emphasize at the beginning of our discussion your background in logic and math, that learning to think about things other than the things you want to think about, really.
Right. Well, of course, those were things I wanted to think about. That was kind of an indulgence, sort of like doing Sudoku, maybe. Pure pleasure, thinking about whether you can find a proof of something. I think studying that sort of thing is great discipline. It's something some people enjoy, some people don't. It isn't essential for doing philosophy, although maybe it helps a little bit. But a lot of people do philosophy who aren't drawn to those technical questions.
Now, in terms of your lecture here on campus and what your current research on, I guess you're working on the problem of blame. Is that?
Yes. It's embarrassing enough to be sitting next to somebody on an airplane and they ask you, "What do you do?" and you have to say you're a philosopher. It carries it to an extreme if they say, "What are you working on?" and say, "Well, for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about blame." They really start edging away from you on the seat.
Well, if you were flying JetBlue, you could.
That's right. But I partly got into this by thinking about questions of free will. That is, everybody thinks that, or many people think that in order to be blamed for something, we have to have done it freely, and that raises a question: are we really free in the relevant sense? So that's a familiar and deep philosophical question. It seems to me, though, that in order to address that question, you've got to first get an idea about what blame is. Because we don't think that in order to be, for people properly to say that you're ugly or handsome or that you have a nice singing voice or whatever, you've got to have freely chosen to have those merits or demerits, as the case may be. So it's something particular about the kind of appraisal that moral criticism or praise involves, that it seems to entail the condition that that kind of criticism is only appropriate if the person has control over whether they are like that or not. Why should that be true? So that's the sort of question that leads you into asking, what are we doing when we're doing this? And there are various candidate answers out there, and I didn't find many of them very satisfactory, so I got interested in the question of thinking about what blame really amounted to, and then that led to a lot of thinking and a lot of changes in mind over a period of years thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that we'll look forward to your book when it comes out, and people will watch the lecture. But in the meantime, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today and giving a sense of philosophy. And let me show the book that we talked about, The Difficulty of Tolerance, Essays in Political Philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. Enjoyed it.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.